Okay. Um, so this week we have been for uh, according to my rough math, must be about 4 months now, looking at a sequence of meditations known as the stages of the path or Lam Rim meditations. And, um, this is a sequence of meditations about 1,000 years old, but it's a condensation of all of the teachings in the Buddhist path. Obviously, we've been presenting it in a very secular, hopefully pretty secular way, but very very nice, rich, condensed explanation of meditation. So if you, um, I can send some notes in the Slack channel about some books that would give a summary of the Lam Rim. I have on my bucket list to write some of my own, but it's you know busy. Um, so, but these meditations on the Lam Rim, they're often done as a cycle of meditation. So when I first met this particular Buddhist tradition that I'd studied with for a long time, there was a book called the Meditation Handbook that had 21 meditations, and we would go in a cycle, every day, or one per day or one per week or whatever you had time for, through the 21, and then you loop back around and you keep doing that, for the rest of your life until you become enlightened, is the theory. And um, very practical, very powerful, nice to have a sequence, kind of like a circuit training in a gym, say. Um, the first of these meditations, uh, the way I received it originally was the meditation on relying on a spiritual guide. But this meditation on relying on a spiritual guide means, in particular, it relates to our relationship with a spiritual teacher. Now, this can be the way that the relationship with a spiritual teacher is handled in Asian societies is different, and it's stronger than was familiar and comfortable in the West. And then there've been a variety of misuses and abuses and so forth of that kind of spiritual relationship in the West prominent. And I don't know if it's, it just, bad news gets all the news coverage. So I don't know if what the real statistics are like. But anyway, became an awkward subject. And so we moved it to be the last of these meditations in this book, with the theory that if you do them in a cycle, this meditation comes around in the same place, whether it's the first or the last, and so forth. So this meditation on relying on a spiritual guide, the meaning of this meditation is thinking specifically about our relationship with the teacher or teachers from whom we receive spiritual instructions. And that relationship is very powerful and very important for a lot of reasons. Now, the basic idea is that our ability to listen and learn depends mostly, if not entirely, on our relationship with the person that we're listening to or learning from. Have you ever had the experience where um, you tried to tell something to someone, you know, especially maybe your partner or somebody who you spend a lot of time with, your kids or whatever, and they just won't listen to you. And then somebody else tells them the exact same thing and they think, oh yes, absolutely, I have to do that. Have you ever noticed that behavior? um, it's just, that's the way we are as human beings. Everything, that knowledge and power do kind of get related, and our ability to take in knowledge depends on having a good relationship with whoever it is that we or I should say admiration for whoever it is that we're receiving advice from. And so uh, recently I was poking around on YouTube and looking at some videos, and you see all these advertisements on the side, and roughly like a third of them for me, and maybe it's just my age group and demographic, they were all like Elon Musk's advice on how to brush your teeth, and Elon Musk's advice on, how to run your business, and all, like, because of his wealth and the sort of celebrity and mystique around him, then people are very willing to listen to him on whatever topic, pretty much. And that's also the case with celebrities, right? Where any kind of celebrity, people look to these celebrities for all kinds of advice, not necessarily well justified, right? Like many of these celebrities are not exactly, you know, they often don't have the optimal skills for managing their own lives, and the lives are disasters and so forth. But when we have admiration for someone for whatever reason, wealth, power, fame, beauty, we're much more likely to listen to them. So the interesting thing is that the people who often do have their lives most under control are not necessarily the wealthiest or the most powerful or the most attractive or the most famous people in the world, right? Um, in fact, you may have entire categories of very, very sincere spiritual teachers, practitioners, and so forth who are deliberately, eschewing wealth and status and appearance and all these kinds of things, but are nevertheless sources of extraordinary wisdom. Right? They've devoted their life to cultivating wisdom. They're just the embodiment of wisdom and peace and joy and happiness and so forth. And it's these people that we need to be admiring most and seeking most to extract wisdom from. And so we need to intentionally cultivate an attitude of respect and admiration for those who have wisdom to impart, and also a mind of gratitude for anyone who offers us clear and correct spiritual teachings with a good motivation. And so that's the topic. And again, I'll just to summarize that. The reason why we need a special motivation is so we will listen. And the reason why we need to listen is so we can change, take the teachings to our heart, put them into practice, actually change our behavior. You probably know by now it is surprisingly hard to change your behavior. Like some behaviors are just pretty deeply entrenched. If we really want to deeply move our mind, we need to be deeply moved by a teacher and the teachings to really take that fully into our heart. So that's the topic we'll look at. But I'd like to begin with some meditation, just an opportunity for us to reflect in this way. So we'll begin with a breathing meditation as usual, but we can transition into a meditation on gratitude. But in particular, we'll focus on a gratitude for having access to spiritual teachings. So that'll be the topic of our meditation. So, as usual, in our meditation's a mental activity, but we can sit comfortably and begin by focusing on our body to help distill our mind. Take a deep breath in and out. Another breath, just allowing ourselves to relax. And then another breath, just asking ourselves what is important right now. And we can spend a little while just becoming aware of our body, especially our breathing, focusing first on our breath at the tips of our nostrils. If our mind wanders, we just return to our breathing. Then we can bring to mind our social circles, those who have influenced us, past or present, our parents, friends, teachers, both ordinary teachers and spiritual teachers, anyone else who's made a mark in our life. Just imagine them around us. We imagine that they are happy, peaceful, and smiling and delighted to be engaging in meditation alongside us. Then we can bring to mind the kindness that we've received throughout our life. But especially we can reflect on the benefit of receiving spiritual teachings. And by spiritual teachings, we mean those teachings that move our heart, really deeply change our perspective on what is important, how we can get control of our own mind. Teachings that illuminate the mind with wisdom, dispel doubt and confusion. We just think what an incredible, incredible legacy we have received to be born in a world where we have access to such teachings and teachers. And for the last couple of minutes, we just hold this feeling of gratitude to have access to spiritual teachings, teachers. Then we can open our eyes and arise from our meditation. So if I think back, I've had maybe maybe a dozen or so spiritual teachers over my life, maybe a little bit more. Certain, to some degree, some authors, if I really made a deep connection with them. To some degree, even my dad was early on a spiritual teacher, um, and but a number of other people who just deeply moved me, and I had the opportunity to study with extensively. And From very early on, we sort of, if you make a connection with teachings that really move your heart, the contrast between your ordinary life and what is opened up when your heart becomes peaceful and joyful and loving and wise and clear and so forth, the contrast is extraordinary. And I think it's when I first started noticing that, um, pretty early on, like when I was a little kid, getting a little bit of meditation instruction in karate class, and then a little bit later from my dad to quell anxiety at a nerdy kid little math conference that I went to. Then at age 16, when you're sort of in the height of the, like, you know, pubescent anxiety and intensity, and then you come across like spiritual texts, books, and I just thought, the world that is being pointed to here, the world of inner peace, is so vastly superior to my normal anxious teenage mind. There's really no comparison, and so that really whet my taste. And if you're listening to this, then clearly something similar has happened to you on some level, in some way. Getting in touch with the power of connecting with a peaceful heart, right? Now, how do we get in touch with the power of a peaceful heart? We really do need a living example to make that connection. And for example, if you want to learn how to play the violin, um, you can listen to music, and maybe you could find a violin, CDs or some book or whatever, but none of them are going to have the power of actually having a teacher, a live teacher, who can not only model for you how to play, they can give you instructions on how to play, and they can give you specific guidance and feedback and training and coaching, right, on how to play. It, it is the same in the context of a spiritual teacher. And a spiritual teacher, there's three characteristics that they offer. First is their example. Second is their instruction. And third is helping to give us the specific guidance that we need about how to behave and how to not behave, and um, that 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 provides us, anyway, the feedback that we need. So three aspects: the example, the instructions, and the feedback and boundaries and guidance and so forth. When we make that connection with a living teacher, what we are receiving is what we refer to as the lineage of their teaching. So each of us have the biological lineage. We all hold the biological lineage of being a human being. And your parents transmitted that biological lineage to you. You're genetically human, right? We have the lineage of our society, the cultural lineage of our society from our parents and friends and teachers and so forth. We've ingested and internalized that society. To take into our hearts spiritual teachings, we need to receive the lineage of spiritual teachings. And the lineage of spiritual teachings is something that's passed along really from person to person, more than just through books. That there is something powerful that is unlocked. So, for example, um, I happened to grab this book called The Mirror of Dharma from, this is my principal, was my principal spiritual teacher for a long time, 15 years. And this book came about later, much later, even after I had stopped being a monk. And one of the things that he did, even though he was almost 90 years old when the book was published, 85 or something like that, is after the book was published, he gathered his he basically had one last big teaching in which he gave an oral transmission of the meaning of the book. And the reason for that is if people receive a book, it's easy for that book to feel like it's outside, right, of us or outside of somebody. It's like words that are read at arm's length and so forth. But when you receive oral teachings or when you see the example of somebody who's put that book into practice, um, we learn it on a much deeper level. And probably as the pandemic has started to lift and you're starting to get back in contact with friends and family and so forth, you're beginning to see the power of meeting in person, right? There's video chats are better than just audio. Audio is better than just books or written word. But there's something special, right? There's something that's conveyed when we're in person together with others, right? There's example, there's present, there's something, I don't know, something in the presence. But it helps us to build trust with that other person. And in the business context that I'm operating in a lot of the time, building trust is critically important, right? You build trust with partners and employees and coworkers and so forth. But in a spiritual context, it's also true that we need to be building trust. And we build trust in a business context so you can exchange goods and services or whatever you're doing, but you build trust in a spiritual context so that we can feel like we have access to the wisdom and inspiration that we need to sustain us in our journey, and the feedback and spiritual friends and so forth that we need to sustain us in our spiritual journey. And so this is the power of spiritual friends in general, but it's the power of spiritual teachers in particular. So um, uh, we use this term spiritual teacher, but we also use the term spiritual guide. So a spiritual guide is someone who does, a teacher teaches, a guide guides. What's the difference between teaching and guiding? You've had teachers who've taught you math, say. Did you learn it? Okay, yes, you learned it. Did it change your life? Not necessarily. When we're talking about a guide is somebody who helps you to move and change from one, not from one, a guide, like a whitewater rafting guide guides you from one place upstream to another place downstream in a river. A spiritual guide guides you from one place, like a place of fear, pain, confusion, um, depression, frustration, whatever, to a different place, a state of peace, contentment, happiness, generosity. So a spiritual guide is someone who moves you and helps you to move through this journey. Now, a qualified spiritual guide has several characteristics. First of all, they show a good example through their behavior. So they need to be a qualified spiritual guide needs to be conducting themselves in a way that is worthy of respect. You can give longer formal lists, but honesty is the main first quality, right? That they're non-deceptive and upright in their behavior, if you want. The second, they need to be giving clear and correct teachings. So someone can be well behaved, but giving mistaken teachings, for example. Now, yeah. So clear, correct teachings. Now, a, sp- a lot of we're at this interesting time, right, where information is exploding, and now people have access to more approximately infinite information. Um, a lot of spiritual teachers and teachings and traditions and so forth are rooted in an earlier time, a simpler time. So, you know, spiritual teachers are not necessarily always to be giving instructions that are perfectly correct, for example, in terms of biology or you would basically you can have someone who's a very highly qualified spiritual teacher who's not necessarily well educated in the modern world. My principal spiritual teacher struggled to use a cordless telephone. You do not want to rely on him for technical advice. You wouldn't rely on him for, a variety of other sets of advice and so forth. That's not his job. You don't go to the doctor to get advice on your car. You don't go to the mechanic to get advice on your health. You don't go to a spiritual teacher for technical advice. What matters is that they know their way around the mind. They know their way around their own mind, and they can help you to navigate around your own mind and your life and behavior. That's the qualification of their teaching. So, good example, correct teachings. And they need a good motivation. So, they need to be giving those teachings with a motivation of love and compassion for their students. So, um, love and compassion doesn't necessarily mean that every spiritual teacher is always going to be soft and mushy, right? Can be a cultural characteristic, right? Um, love and compassion. Love means that you're concerned. We meditated on love and compassion, right, over the last couple of months. Love means you're concerned for others that they be happy. Compassion means you're concerned that others be free from suffering. What does that feel like? How do you relate towards somebody else if you have love and compassion for them? Well, how do you relate towards yourself? Because, for example, you want yourself to be happy, you want yourself to be free from suffering. What's your relationship with yourself? Is it mushy? Is it soft? I don't know. Sometimes, we let ourselves off the hook a lot. Oh, you deserve a snack. Yes, sure you do. Of course you do. You know, but sometimes we can be hard with ourselves, but also out of love for ourselves, right? Like we can be firm with ourselves, like, okay, no, definitely you've got to get this done. I don't care if you're tired, you can push on, whatever. We can be firm with ourselves because we love ourselves. You can be firm with somebody else because you love them, right? Um, and so love and compassion means you want somebody to be happy and you want them to be free from suffering. You know, what does it take to be happy and free from suffering? It's nice if people are nice and gentle with us. Sometimes people just need to be a bit brusque with us and like move on. Sometimes that's what's in our best interest. It depends on the situation, right? So it's not the outer demeanor of the teacher that determines whether they're a loving, compassionate person, right? You have to spend some time with them to get a sense for what's their motivation. Are they doing this for themselves, for their own benefit? Are they doing this for our benefit? Are they mostly concerned for themselves? Or are they mostly concerned for others? That's the qualification. So, good example, correct teachings given with the correct motivation. If you can find, you know, if you can find a spiritual guide who possesses these three qualities, and then you can find this longer lists I can pass along if you want. If you can find a spiritual guide that possesses at least these three qualities, you should rely upon that person. Now, how do we know if their teachings are correct or not? Well, in the beginning, if our knowledge of spiritual teachings is not so strong, maybe it's a bit hard to tell, right? A lot of books out there, a lot of teachers out there. Oh, we can try things out in our own experience and see if the teachings work and actually help us to improve our life. That's the real litmus test of a teaching. Buddha's advice was, don't trust what I say just because people say that I'm the Buddha, just because I'm called the Buddha. He said you need to examine these teachings thoroughly with wisdom, as carefully as you would assay gold. And so, um, the idea with that is, if you're, especially in the old, like, well, like if you go to a store and you've got like a $50 bill, and the cashier like checks it under an ultraviolet light, that's the modern way of assaying whether something's gold or not. Yeah, it's like, does it look like it's authentic? So, um, we need to check any spiritual teachings carefully to make sure that they are authentic, that they work when we put them into practice, that they're self-consistent. Um, but at some point, we need to make a decision that, you know, well, I don't know. I don't know. This is America, right? America, you've got access to infinite whatever you want, right? Infinite information, different spiritual teachings, books, and whatever else. But certainly, the way it works traditionally is that at some point you need to make a choice, and it's like, you make a choice about which spiritual teacher you're going to follow, teachings you're going to follow, tradition you're going to follow, not because one of them is the only right one and everybody else is wrong, but because there's only one of you, and there's only a finite amount of time, and you need to be listening and learning and doing the best you can to try to internalize these teachings, change your mind, and make sense of things. Um, Different spiritual teachings use different language to describe. Sometimes they use different language to describe the same thing. Sometimes they use the same language to describe different things. And sometimes they're teaching entirely and completely diametrically opposed practices. And I think when I was young, when I was a teenager, and then everything, it's, all this spiritual, I didn't understand, all the spiritual teachings that I encountered when I was a teenager. They were mostly in the form of like mystical poetry, and it all sounded cool and intriguing. None of it made a whole lot of clear sense to me. And so I couldn't really distinguish between this teaching and that teaching and what people were talking about. And so it seemed like this very vague world, right? But the reality is that the spiritual world is vague only for as long, only insofar as our own clarity about the mind is vague. If your clarity about what's going on in your own mind is kind of vague and fuzzy, then yeah, the spiritual world is kind of vague and fuzzy. But the more clear and crisp we become about what's actually happening in our own mind and others' minds, and how the mind works to make us happy or unhappy, the more you realize that you can describe, this spiritual world, so to speak, the spiritual path, as clearly and explicitly as you could describe any external things. If you were, lost in a forest, all you see is just a bunch of trees, and everything looks equally like trees everywhere. It's kind of outdated analogy. We don't probably get lost in forests very often anymore, but I think you get it. Um, if you get to know that forest, it becomes very familiar. You get to know even the look of certain trees, the lay of the land. You can, even something that seemed indistinguishable and strange at first, you get to know with time anyway. So in this way, we can get to know, and in this way, we can get to know the mind. We can get to know spiritual teachings. We can realize, yeah, we can understand that, they can be described in very, very clear terms, learned and put into practice. So, okay, so what does it mean to? So I've just talked about who is a spiritual guide. What are the qualifications of a spiritual guide? Why do we need to rely upon a spiritual guide? Now, the last point: how do you rely on a spiritual guide? How do we rely upon a spiritual guide? There's two ways. First of all, is developing special attitude towards that person, attitudes of, um, traditionally we say faith and respect. faith or admiration, if you're not comfortable with the term faith and respect, or admiration and respect. Faith really just means we're giving this person the benefit of the doubt strongly. They may not look fancy, they may not look special, they may speak in clumsy ways, they may make some mistakes. We hang in there. We don't let ourselves get caught up with apparent faults or flaws. That's what it means. That's the special mental attitude. And we can do this in a number of ways, but one of them is just contemplating their kindness in giving us access to spiritual teaching. So that's how we develop a special attitude. And the second is relying on a spiritual guide through acts of service and devotion. This is the way it's traditionally framed. And so you can offer actions of verbal praise or physical praise, like showing respect, saying this person's, praising this person and so forth. These are acts of verbal praise. You can offer gifts and so forth. Now, and a qualified spiritual teacher, you can give money, you can give them your house, you can sign it, put them in your will, all this stuff. Now, a qualified spiritual teacher is not interested in any of those things. That's one way you can know if the person's qualified or not. But ideally, like traditionally, you give that person something like this, and then they just immediately give it to somebody else. And anyway, I've run out of time, but there's all these really funny, beautiful stories of people like. I've run out of time, I think, but just real fast, a friend of mine worked super hard to make some exquisite, unique, one of a kind gift for our spiritual teacher, and went and presented it to him. And he's like, "Oh, it's very beautiful. It's amazing." I don't even remember what it was. No. And then nearing the end of their visit with that person, somebody else came in the room to visit and ask advice from this teacher. And the teacher immediately greeted that person and said, "Oh, so good to see you. Here, take this thing," whatever it was, and just immediately passed along that gift. And of course, my friend was just mortified because for them that gift was the teacher would keep it in their possession forever and always remember how special that student was, right? Because they had their own sense of specialness wrapped up in that gift. But for the teachers, a perfect way to help uproot the student's sense of specialness, right? Like wrenching it out of them. It's like, "Oh no, that was not for you. You're not important. I don't want you. That was my chance to be special in this person's eyes." So that's what we call spiritual guidance. Anyway, but you can also offer acts of service, and that was one of the ones that I really went whole hog, and I basically tried to give all my skills and my energy and so forth for many years. And I'm still trying to give my service and acts of service to my teacher. But the fourth and most important way is to put their teachings into practice. This is the most important way that we can show gratitude and devotion and respect to spiritual teachers, to actually put their teachings into practice. And if you get to know the mind, you'll realize that that's actually the hardest offering to give. That's the rarest and most precious one, is really taking these teachings very seriously, taking them deep into our heart. And really changing our mind, because that is the greatest gift. And if we can give that gift, then what happens is that the teacher comes to live inside of us, because in fact that teacher is then living in us and coming out through our words and deeds and thoughts, and we've deeply internalized the meaning of their instruction. And at that point, the teacher, we're engaging. In that point, we've given all of the other gifts to the teacher, because the teacher is then living inside of our heart, and everything we do is then always influenced by them, and we then are in a position to bring similar benefit to others. So thank you so much for staying on a little bit longer, and I'm glad to have a chance to share this with you. So we'll take just 1 minute to reflect on the changes that we've made in our mind, even in this brief time, gained increased understanding and inner peace, good motivation. we can think through changing our mind in this way, may we more and more deeply internalize these teachings and thus increase our capacity to bring benefit to others. Okay, thank you very much.